good afternoon, and welcome to Excel and Ed's second Wednesday webinar on ESSA. We'll be starting in just a couple minutes, but you're in the right place. Please hold on. As you can all see, you're in the right place. We're just going to give another couple minutes for folks to join. All right, great. Well, thank you all for joining, both those of you who are new and those of you who were with us last week. I'm Claire Voorhees. I am the Director of K-12 Policy at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, and really happy to have all of you to work with us to navigate this new federal law. For those of you who were with us last week, we covered the themes and the main themes of ESSA and the timeline that states are going to have to navigate. For those of you who missed it, it's available on Excel and Ed's YouTube channel. You'll also get a link to it in an email following this, and also a YouTube of this. We're recording this as well. This week, as you probably know, we'll begin to dig deeper into what ESSA means for state accountability systems, particularly today with a focus on standards and assessments. We want to try to make these things bite-sized because there's so much in the law relevant to each of these pieces. We can look forward to that. Some housekeeping. As with last week, you are on mute. Feel free to eat that late afternoon sandwich or cookie, whatever your needs are. And thanks also for sending all the great questions that came in. They've really helped us figure out what the topics are that mean the most to you and are of most interest. And please keep them coming throughout. It's really helpful for us to know how, whether we're giving the right level of detail, what you guys were interested in, making it more of an interactive thing. So please send them, and we'll do our best to answer them. With that, I want to send you down to my colleague Alex in Tallahassee, as you can see from the bright sunny skies and whatever the heck that is over his left shoulder.
Oh, it just happened to be there. Thank you so much, Claire, and thanks everybody again for joining us this week. Where we're going to start in this conversation is we're going to start to kind of level set a bit. Claire later is going to deep dive into some components of accountability, and we'll do more of that next week as well. But where we're going to start is let's just sort of level set the basic question of what is the purpose of a state accountability system? And it seems like maybe a rudimentary question, but for ESSA, because the requirements are going to cause so many states to reopen statutes, to reopen state board rules, things of that nature, it's a healthy starting point to say, what is the actual purpose of an accountability system? And that answer is going to be different in every state, in part because no two states have the same accountability system, but also in part because your priorities are going to be different. You may go about this process and say, we're really going to focus on assessments because that's the hot burning issue in our state. That's what we need to get right. Then again, you may say we want to take on the whole kitchen sink. So for you, it's a question of priorities, and of course, are already what your starting point is. But asking that question, what is a state accountability system? We've on this first slide put forward our version of the answer. This is our answer, so I'll say that up front. This may not be the same answer that a lot of you have, but this is our answer to that question. Both things that are required and things that are in addition to what's required. But ESSA touches on all these points, and so they're important to dive into. And again, certain ones may be more important to you than others. For us, an accountability system involves high quality standards, high quality assessments. But it also involves a very clear process, a very transparent process of identifying schools that are succeeding, schools that are struggling, and then reporting that information outwardly to the public, to parents, the teachers, and then of course, as many of you know, the supports and interventions that come along with schools that are identified as struggling schools. So asking this question, having that level-setting conversation with you, your other state partners, is a great place to start so that you can then identify how you want to go about ESSA implementation and what's important to you. And as we go to the next slide, the important thing is to understand right off the top, and again, Claire will take a deeper dive into this, but the important thing to understand off the top is the changes in terms of these 5 component categories. Mainly the changes between the federal government's role and the state's roles. In the case of standards and assessments, talk about standards for a second. Under No Child Left Behind, the federal government was prohibited from reviewing and approving state standards. ESSA takes that a whole nother step further and actually prohibits the federal government from giving states any incentives to adopt a particular set of standards. So a lot of this is the Common Core backlash that played out in Congress. So ESSA is similar, but it takes it a whole nother step further for states in saying that the feds cannot even coerce a state into a particular set of standards. Assessments, under No Child Left Behind, federal government had a process of review and approve assessments through peer review. That's not actually going to change, except to say that for the past couple of years, that process has been on hold in many states because states transitioning. So this process is going to play out a little further, but overall, it is actually very similar to what was under No Child Left Behind. Where things really change dynamically are the next 3 categories. In the goals category, previously all states had to have the same goal, which was 100% proficiency, and with each subgroup overall and within each subgroup. That has changed. Now states decide what their goals are, and U.S. DOE is actually prohibited from prescribing state goals. So the power has really shifted to the states here, and that may be a very important role that many of you play in ESSA implementation. School designation, all state accountability systems under No Child Left Behind were organized around the goal of each subgroup also reaching 100% proficiency by 2014. States had no flexibility in this, but then the system of waivers came in. And so states achieved that flexibility via waivers. Of course, we talked last week, you were on the webinar last week, we talked about the fact that waivers are going away. And so where we're going to land is states are going to have more flexibility in the strictest sense from No Child Left Behind in terms of establishing goals for each subgroup. However, I would say it's actually less flexibility than under the waiver system. So it's somewhere in between. So the states have a greater role to play here, but it is actually less flexibility than states have under the current waivers right now. And that's sometimes I'd say it's probably something of a common misconception. And that's something in the school designation we will dive to a lot more next week after covering it lightly today. And then supports interventions. This is actually the component of No Child Left Behind that has changed the most under ESSA. Under No Child Left Behind, the federal government established a very specific sequence of consequences based on the need to intervene with a school. The states now will have incredible flexibility to determine that. So whether a state is interested in using school choice, chartering, school closures, some mix of these, as a way to intervene and help with struggling schools, states are going to have this flexibility, but states are also going to have a lot of questions to answer. And in many ways, when you think about those issues like choice and charters, they provide a greater range of opportunity for states. But of course, the more effective, more flexible opportunities like that also tend to be the more politically weighty, bigger discussions in legislative hallways. So supports and intervention, states have a lot of flexibility, have a lot of opportunity, but it's also going to carry a lot of political discussion when you actually get into the legislature. So opportunity comes with the need to lobby for those opportunities. With that said, Claire is now going to take a deeper dive into standards and assessments, and then we'll come back later and we'll talk more about some testing options when Claire finishes.
Absolutely. So thanks, Alex. Now we're back here in rainy DC. So yeah, as Alex said, we're going to now, throughout the rest of today and then next week's webinar, we're going to pick off each component of an accountability system and talk through what the implications are under ESSA, the risks, the opportunities, and really dig into what the law says on each of the topics. So we'll start with standards, which is actually the easiest piece of this because they're the fewest changes. ESSA's requirements for standards are actually not very different than the prior federal law, the No Child Left Behind. Under ESSA, states must develop challenging academic standards in reading, math, and science. Note that the legislation doesn't use the words college and career ready. That was because a lot of folks on the right, the anti-Common Core, just thought that was code for the Common Core. So challenging is the word in the legislation. That's the set of standards that a state develops or has in place must apply to all students in the state, except for those students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, for whom the state may develop alternative standards. And states must demonstrate that their standards are aligned with college entrance requirements and with relevant career and technical education standards. Which brings up an interesting issue here, because you said, wait a second, Alex just said that federal law prohibits the U.S. Department of Education from requiring states to submit their standards for review, or from the U.S. DOE requiring a state to add or subtract a standard. So how are they going to make sure that the state standards are high quality? It's a really good question if you were thinking about it, and one will play out over time. It's unclear how the department would enforce such a requirement. The short answer is that the department will likely take states at their word on this. States will have to provide an assurance that they've adopted, that they've met these requirements, that they've adopted or have in place challenging academic standards in their state plans. So they have to make an assurance of that. Plus, when they submit their standards when they submit their assessments for peer review, there will have to be some check by the department. Do those assessments align to whatever standards that the state has in place? But as you might imagine, given the recent hullabaloo over the Common Core, and that's a technical term I use, it's really unlikely that the department is going to interfere with states' decisions over standards under this new law. So what does that mean for your state? Well, in most states, it doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot. You know, your state can continue to use the standards it has in place that it has adopted or revised over the past couple of years. If your state is in the middle of any sort of standards review process, that will likely continue without any federal interference. It'll be a wholly state decision about what happens with those standards. Any questions on that piece? Sam, standards are kind of the easy part here. We're warming up with some of the easy part. Great. Moving on, we turn now to assessments, the second component, key component of a state's accountability system. And before digging into the details of ESSA's requirements for standards, we thought it was important to do another bit of a level set, because ESSA does have a lot to say on assessments. So we think that really the first thing you should do, both in a webinar when you're talking about the law, but also in your state, is to think about what are the characteristics of a high-quality system. What do we want our assessment system to look like now and in 5 years and in 10 years? And then from there we can go and look at ESSA and say, what are the tools in this law and what other opportunities does the transition to the law give us to make our assessment system better? So this slide gives, like the slide on components of an accountability system, this slide gives our take, and one that's probably similar to one held by the Council of Chief State School Officers, or CCSSO, of what is a high-quality assessment system. This is not specifically what's required in ESSA, but rather our view of what it should look like. It should, and most would probably agree with this, an assessment should provide meaningful, timely, and accurate data. It should be aligned to standards. It should provide results that are comparable with other states. Importantly, parents should know the purpose and how the results will help their child. The fewer better tests. We should get the best possible information using the fewest possible tests and the least possible testing time. And the assessment outcomes should be used to do things like strengthen instruction and target interventions to struggling students. Again, these are not specific ESSA requirements. Some of them are, some of them aren't. This is just a view of what the goal should be, what the sort of gold star is that we're heading for when we look at ESSA and its requirements and the opportunities that it creates for states. So we'll dive in first to, we'll turn into what does ESSA have to say about assessments, and what are the requirements we'll start with, and then what are the real opportunities under the law. And Alex will help me get at that as well. And the short story on assessments, the main takeaway is that ESSA really does preserve the basic requirements related to testing that have been in place left behind. But the law does give states a ton of interesting opportunities to innovate and streamline and improve their assessment systems. So this will be an interesting time, an important time for us to really, as advocates and policymakers, kind of start to take assessments in a really good direction. This law provides that opportunity. As usual with this law, the long story of assessments is a little bit more complicated than that. But to begin, the law preserves the annual assessment requirements that have been in place under No Child Left Behind since 2001. States must still assess their students, all of their students, in reading and math in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school, and they must assess them in science at least once each grade span. So basically once in elementary, once in middle, once in high. An interesting bit of flexibility that ESSA does allow is for districts at the high school level. So under the law, a state is allowed to permit its districts to use the word law is locally selected, nationally recognized high school assessment. And they can use, districts could use this in place of the traditional statewide assessment at the high school level. The proposed if you're wondering what locally selected, nationally recognized high school assessment means, you're not alone. And that's something that the U.S. Department of Education is having to define in regulations. They've put out a first proposal for that through the negotiated rulemaking process. And so we'll see this in the department's proposed rules. And their proposed definition is that it must be administered in multiple states and used by higher education for entrance or placement. Essentially what this means is we're looking at SAT, ACT, PARCC, Smarter Balanced, Advanced Placement, or IB exams. But there's some important notes here. This is not an open season, every district can do what it wants kind of situation. There's a lot of limits on this. The first is that it's up to the state to decide whether or not districts are allowed to do it at all. The second is that it's only at the high school level. We've already seen some legislation in states that would allow this sort of thing in the 3rd through 8th grade. That is not permitted by federal law. It is only permitted at the high school level, this flexibility. The second is that it must be a single assessment within a district. So you can't have one district that offer its students the ACT, the SAT, and AB. It has to be one assessment per district if the state is. And the other couple important requirements is that they must meet the use of these tests must meet the technical requirements of under federal law for assessments. So that means that if you use these assessments, they have to be aligned to your standards. That might not actually be a light lift if you think about it. Does necessarily the ACT, a college entrance exam, necessarily align to the standards in your state? If it doesn't, but you want to use it, then there's some work to be done. You could add items. It's not an insurmountable problem, but it's one that has to be overcome if you're going to use that. These tests must also meet all the other technical requirements, validity, reliability, comparability, and must go through the peer review process at the federal level. So it's an interesting flexibility, but it's certainly not, and one we've already seen interest in. I think with good reason, districts want to eliminate a statewide test and use the ACT or SAT. There are a lot of good reasons to do that, but we just exercise caution. It's not quite as easy as next point on assessment requirements around English learners. As I mentioned last week, there's a big change shifting accountability for the performance for English language proficiency from Title III, a much smaller provision of federal law, to Title I, and that now accountability for English learners is going to be in your main accountability system. And with that comes some changes related to assessment for English language learners. One is that it's been made explicit that states must have one statewide test for English language proficiency. The good news is all states currently do. The interesting new requirement is that, or at least proposed requirement by the department in negotiated rulemaking, is that states must make every effort to develop tests in other languages that are present in the state to a significant state. So, and this means that a state must have at least one English language proficiency exam, but they're encouraged to create others for languages for languages that are present in the state to a significant extent. Not a requirement, but could be an interesting hook for advocates to push a state to create a new test. if that's in the best interest of the kids. It'll be an interesting balance to see how many states start creating additional tests, because obviously if you do that, it has to be a high quality one and meet all the technical requirements of the law. So an interesting thing to watch going forward. On that, before shifting to opt-out issues, are there any questions, Sam?
First one is, will states weaken academic standards again to improve student achievement numbers?
Okay, interesting. So this is a great question. And I think this question gets at the idea that under No Child Left Behind, there was a view that there were incentives in the law to essentially make it easy to lower proficiency cut scores, or essentially make it easier to pass state tests. I think we'll see less of that under ESSA for a couple of reasons. One is that the main incentive for lowering proficiency standards has been removed. Under No Child Left Behind, you could be labeled as failing if just one subgroup missed their goals. Under ESSA, there's a lot more flexibility for states to determine their own goals and design their own consequences for that. So there won't be as much incentive to lower that proficiency cut score. The second reason, I think, is that, and the good news is that over the past few years, most states have raised their proficiency cut scores. Thanks a lot, I think, to some great advocacy from a lot of groups. The proficiency cut scores are very high, or are where they should be now in most states, and reflect true college and career readiness. And I think there'll be a lot of pressure for states to keep it that way.
The second question is, will students receive proper accommodations if states and districts choose to use nationally recognized assessments?
Oh yeah, great question, and a relevant one is how are students with disabilities going to fare if a district decides to use, you know, the ACT, SAT. It's been a huge issue in the past that of whether or not those tests offer the appropriate accommodations to students with disabilities. It's looking like, yes, that will happen under negotiated rulemaking. The Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, has proposed language that would require states to make sure that accommodations provided under those tests made sure that the results, assured that the results of those tests were still valid and that all students have an opportunity to participate in them. So this will be another thing that will be challenging for states to do technically, but we can be assured that they will have to do it if they decide to make that shift. So,
one more question.
Mm-hmm.
So relating back to just the locally selected high school assessment, what happens if high schools within a district are designated either AP or IB? Can the district recognize both, or can they only choose one?
And, you know, interesting question. That's a great question. Not at this point. Based on my understanding of what the department has proposed in negotiated rulemaking, is that it would have to be one assessment, so that those schools would probably, those IB schools would probably have to have to do whatever the district is doing, or double test if that's what they've been doing. You can't make exceptions unless it was a high school that was its own, a charter school that was its own district. Then you would be able to have your own assessment there. But my understanding is it's going to be the department is going to hold the line on making sure it's one assessment across the district. That could change in rulemaking, but that's where we seem to be headed. Moving on to a really important topic, another frequently asked question, in large part because for two reasons. One, because it's really confusing under the law, and two, because there's a lot of misinformation about this. And this is the issue of opt-out and participation rates. Some have said that ESSA, quote, allows opt-out. That is certainly not the case. But as with most things under this law, it's not as simple as we'd like it to be. I think there are four key points that we've laid out here on this slide that I'd like to walk through and hopefully help everyone understand the new requirements here. starting first with the top 2 points, which actually have not changed under the law. The first is that, like under No Child Left Behind, the law states, the ESSA states that states must test at least 95% of students overall and within each subgroup. So that participation requirement is still in place. The second thing that ESSA states explicitly, but has always been the case, is that states determine whether individual parents are legally permitted to opt their students out of assessment. So it is up to each state to decide whether they pass a law requiring or explicitly prohibiting parents from opting their students out. That is up to a state to decide, as it always has been. The second 2 bullet points are what's new under the law and what's a little bit more fuzzy. The third bullet is that, unlike under No Child Left Behind, states determine the consequences for schools that fail to meet the 95% requirement. What that means is that it is unlike under No Child Left Behind, where you automatically were labeled a failure if you failed to meet that 95% participation bar. Now it'll be up to the state. If a state wants to be really hardcore and wants to dissuade opt-out, then they could say, if you don't meet the 95% requirement, you drop a letter grade. That's, in fact, as an organization, what we might recommend, that states are very tough on opt-out. But a state that wanted to be looser on opt-out could just, for example, put a frowny face on the school's report card. There's no, as long as they're required to have some consequence, but there's no requirement that it, under the federal law, that it be strict or less strict. The final bullet is one that's often overlooked and a really interesting one, is that there is a consequence to opt-out that is built into the law. And if you'll follow me, it's a little bit of a mind twister, but hopefully an example will help. When calculating the proficiency rate at a particular school, states have to use as a denominator the greater of 95% of all students or the number of students actually participating in the assessment. What that means is that if you have a school, it basically has a built-in consequence if a lot of kids opt out, because your proficiency rate goes down. So, for example, if you have a school of 100 kids, and I'm looking at my notes so I don't get twisted on this myself. If you have a school of 100 kids and 50 students opt out, but 40 students pass the test, the denominator, what you are going to look at, your percent proficient, is 40 students who passed over 95 students. So your proficiency rate is around 42%, pretty low. The denominator is not 50. Those kids who didn't take the test, most of them are counted. So that because if you did count it, it would be, if it's not 40 out of 50 students who took the test, which would be an 80% proficiency rate, it's actually 40 students who passed over 95 students. So that means that if you have a school, a traditionally high-performing school, and a ton of kids opt out, their grade or their school rating will reflect that. It will show low proficiency rates in that school. So that could be another incentive that, to dissuade folks from opt-out. Any questions on that? Because there should be, Sam, or maybe people are still processing.
No questions on that one.
Okay, and please send them in as they come up, because I know that one's a bit of a mind twister. Shifting, before I send it back to Alex, shifting now from the requirements for assessments under ESSA to the opportunities. And as we stated earlier, ESSA does really provide states with a lot of great opportunities to, while preserving that annual testing requirement, to change the way, to improve their assessment systems, to start to change the way that they test kids. The first is an interesting one, is that assessment audits. Under the law, the U.S. Secretary of Education can make competitive grants to states of $1.5 million or more to look at their assessment systems, clean it out, get rid of duplicative or low quality assessments at the local and school level. And in fact, even this year, for those interested, you can email us. Grants of up to $200,000 are available under this year's grants under an existing grant program. So states that are interested can start to think about this right now. The next great option is new delivery options. So maintaining those annual assessments, states can now deliver those assessments in new ways. They can, instead of giving one test at the end of the year, they can give a number of interim sets throughout the year and roll the results up into a final summative score. States are also allowed to deliver their annual assessments in part through portfolios, projects, or performance tasks. Another interesting option. And also computer adaptive assessments are explicitly allowed. That's been happening under No Child Left Behind, but it was always a little fuzzy on whether it was allowed or not. That's now explicitly allowed. Innovative Assessment and Accountability Demonstration Authority is something I'll dive into after Alex has a chance to give some recommendations, because that requires a little bit more explanation. But I will say, so what does this mean? What do all these new options mean for your state? And what's next for your state? It's important to realize that as all these new options become available, that again, it's not open season. As Alex mentioned earlier, federal law does require that all state assessment systems be submitted to the U.S. Department of Education and undergo peer review and approval to make sure that they meet the technical requirements of the law. They won't be judging the content so much as just making sure it meets technical assessment requirements. Because ESSA did not change the technical requirements of assessments very much, that process is actually going to start up again. Because of all the transitions of new assessments, it's been put on hold for a couple of years. This spring and this summer, states will start to submit their existing assessment systems for peer review. For those states that have already settled on and have a new assessment in place, they'll probably submit right away. For states that are administering new tests this year, there's a lag time where you need to have your results in before you submit. So they'll submit them for review probably into next year. But anytime a state makes a significant change to their assessment, they need to resubmit. So over the coming years, as states decide to adopt some of these new options, new delivery options, that would be, they'd have to resubmit and make sure that their tests still meet the technical requirements of the law. Any questions on that?
Yeah, first question is, does allowing computer adaptive testing mean there's flexibility in the ways students are assessed on grade level standards? Okay, yeah, there will probably be, as I said earlier, computer adaptive assessments are explicitly allowed, and in the recent negotiated rulemaking process, the U.S. Department of Education has proposed, and the negotiators agreed to language that would allow states to give, to include in computer adaptive assessments content that is both above and below grade level, as long as the assessment still allowed for a determination of whether or not an individual student was on the grade level to which they were assigned. Gotcha. We have two more. So the second question is, will ESSA help to facilitate student comparisons across state lines?
Oh, yes, good question. So whether we'll have more information to compare results across state lines. You know, nothing in ESSA requires it, actually. The law, I mean, the good news is the law does require that states continue to participate in the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, or the Nation's Report Card, as you may know it. And as you may know, the results of state NAEP results allow us to compare how tough the tests are in various states. So if state A on its state test gets 80% proficient, but then they take the NAEP and they only get 30% proficient, we know that their test might be too easy. So we'll continue to be able to compare that way. And as Alex may mention next, it really is up to the states. The states should feel free to include items in their test and put things in place so that their assessment results are comparable across state lines, even if they don't participate in one of the testing consortia.
And last question is, can districts also apply for assessment inventory grants? Does that go along with?
Oh, for the specific, you know, that is actually one I know. We can get back to you. I'm not. I believe that the assessment audits are to states, to SEAs, and not to districts, but I'd have to confirm that. It's a great question. Not positive. Excellent. Well, kicking it back down to Tallahassee and the Gators.
Right team, wrong town. Thank you, Claire. With a lot of what Claire was talking about in terms of some of what we've seen this year in states regarding testing, regarding opt-out, but then when you look at ESSA, and not just ESSA, actually just some things you could do under probably current law in many of your states, or with some slight tweaks to law in your state, there's a real pressure versus opportunity here, and which is what kind of brings us to this topic of fewer, better tests. There's, of course, in many states, we saw in states like Arizona, Georgia, West Virginia, Tennessee, Florida, Kentucky, others this year, a lot of pressure around opt-out or other types of anti-testing type of proposals. But then there's opportunity, as you know, you're going to have to reopen to some degree or another, even if you're just transitioning your statutes. You're going to have to some degree open up state law regarding assessments and accountability. There's opportunity. Even if you're literally just saying, we just want to take our current system, tweak it as little as possible, but just transition it to an ESSA compliant system and be done with it, there's opportunity in statute in other ways, state board rules, to say, well, we're going to make the system more transparent. We're going to provide a higher quality of information to parents, a higher quality of information to teachers. And there's ways to streamline your testing system as well to address some of the questions that feed into the opt-out movement, but they're questions that, as Claire was talking about, there are dollars that are available to states, some right now and some with ESSA, available to states to audit your assessment system. So this notion of fewer, better tests is sort of an emerging discussion for us, but it's also for a number of other states, and we're seeing some of the issues that you're looking at in this slide coming up in some state legislatures. You know, Arizona dealt with this issue very head-on this year, and successfully so, but other states have had a tough time in terms of legislative battles. And so the thinking is get ahead of the game, both leverage what's in ESSA, the funding that's available, the flexibility that's available in ESSA in terms of when assessments are administered, that sort of thing. Get ahead of the game, use the law, but also use, frankly, some tools that you don't even need the federal law for in terms of messaging better to parents, to teachers, to students, the value of assessments, what a high-quality assessment looks like, what a high-quality assessment does for the student. For the purpose of just some examples to sort of kind of give you some ideas of what I'm talking about, last year in 2015, Illinois, the Illinois State Board of Education did a pilot program in 3 districts where they talked to teachers and they evaluated what tests the teachers actually find informative versus what are duplicative. And then at the end of the pilot, those districts actually reduced some unnecessary testing. But that just going through that process creates some confidence for the educators in those districts. State of Tennessee last year created a study committee or a study commission on testing and assessments and came up with essentially a set of principles that these are the principles by which the state is going to use and assess students, and it creates some buy-in. It's a buy-in process. Last year, the state of Florida took it even a step further and passed a fewer, better test bill, which is sort of where we've coined now our emerging policy area, but passed a bill that actually did things like put caps on state and local testing time, actually eliminated, very carefully studied and eliminated some duplicative tests at the state level and local level, and really at the end was able to quantifiably return a certain amount of instructional time to teachers in districts. Those are just some ideas, but there's many other things that could be done in terms of saying, okay, we need to better message to parents, teachers, others, this is the value of testing, this is what a good test does, this is the information that a good test puts forward, and it can be very useful things to do, empowering teachers, as the slide notes, providing more time for instruction, empowering teachers with timely information. Some of the most interesting things that we've gotten from both from some survey work that we did last year and also just talking to teachers is that when teachers get the test, and if they get the test, is sometimes such a, I shouldn't say it's a simple thing, but it's a very important thing. The teacher of record next year, I don't know any state where the teacher of record next year, maybe there are a couple where the teacher of record next year gets the child's test from the year before, so they know a little bit more about that student when that student comes into the classroom. And seldom are tests in states, with a few exceptions, seldom are tests done in the last couple weeks of the school year. So usually there's testing, and then there's basically some instructional time that's sort of lost after a test are administered. So a lot of concepts that could be considered. Some of these are actually opportunities under ESSA, the funding opportunities, some of the flexibility that Claire was talking about earlier. But some of these you could do without ESSA. You could start really considering now getting some buy-in, or just creating a process where you use that process to get buy-in and also better educate the public at the same time. With that said, Claire or Sam, are there any questions on testing?
The first question, I feel like a floating voice from the sky. What Prologue Argument should we expect to hear from teachers and other anti-testing advocates?
Sure, that's a really good question. This year in Georgia, I use Georgia as an example. There was an opt-out bill that actually Governor Deal just vetoed, but it got through the legislature. The bill was largely argued on what I would say are some of the fringe issues, but then those fringe issues are taken to be, they're expressed as they're the norm. So a lot of the argument was based on, well, what about students with very extreme, severe disabilities? And it was glossed over that the state already had policies regarding these situations. So I think a lot of times the opt-out movement takes really extreme examples and paints them as they're the norm. And as a practical matter, the best, well, there's a couple things. One obviously good response, to that is just publicly presenting the facts. But as a practical matter, you need a legislator in each legislative chamber who can actually explain those issues. It's something that we found in multiple states where Louisiana, in 2014, this issue came up, and the state had very good policies in place already regarding students in extreme circumstances, but there was a lack of maybe one legislator who could actually explain the issue, and so that can be tricky. You need legislative champions in your education committees, at least one in each education committee, and at least one on the legislative floor who can actually explain that issue and really know it. And when those questions come up, that's the go-to person who can address that and knock the answer right out of the park. Any other questions?
Nope, I think we're good.
That's it on our end. Great. Well, I think we've we've teased the issue enough, so we can move to the innovative assessment and accountability demonstration authority. So this is one of the biggest opportunities and frankly biggest risks in the new law. And for shorthand, you should know this new program is known as the Innovative Assessment Pilot for shorthand. This is a pilot program that allows, really the history of this is seeing that wanting to preserve traditional annual assessments, but wanted to give kind of an on-ramp to states that were really ready to change the way that they are teaching, move to competency-based education, and therefore need a different type of assessment to help them get there. And what this pilot does is allows the U.S. Secretary of Education to select up to 7 states to experiment with new innovative assessment and accountability systems. And as I said before, we think it is a phenomenal opportunity for the right state. A committed state can really use this opportunity to propel their transition towards competency-based education or some other type of innovative type of learning and accountability model. But we should also say that it's not for the faint of heart. This is a program that would allow you to start experimenting with a new innovative form of assessment and accountability in a few districts in a state, and as soon as you start doing that, stop giving the traditional statewide assessment in that district or in the relevant grades. Because of that, there's some pretty onerous requirements around this opportunity, as there probably should be. It's really not for the faint of heart. States must still ensure, they still must meet, even in this new model of assessment, whatever it may be, they still must meet the technical requirements of the law and go through peer review. That means the results have to be valid, they have to be reliable, they have to be comparable statewide. The other really major requirement states should be aware of is that the assessment system has to be ready to go statewide. You can't keep it in a couple districts in perpetuity and have kind of 2 different systems. You have to have a plan within 5, and there are available extensions, but within 5 or 7 years to take that innovative assessment system and have it statewide within a pretty limited period of time. Most of you have probably heard that New Hampshire is one of the states leading the way here. They're seen as a leader in competency-based education. But the folks involved in New Hampshire will be the first to tell you that it's not for the faint of heart. It's an incredibly challenging, incredibly rewarding thing to do to change the way that you test. But New Hampshire's they've been at it for about a decade. And they're only doing it in 4 districts so far, and those are New Hampshire districts. Those aren't California districts or New York City. Plus, New Hampshire's had a ton of outside support, both technical and financial. So, this is all to say that for the right state, this is a phenomenal opportunity. But we also think there are some serious risks involved in this pilot. The risks are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. The first is that this could end up being an end run around accountability, where there's some concern that states will be drawn to this opportunity simply because you can stop giving the statewide assessment. That's not the right motivation for participation in this. It should really be used to support a whole new way of teaching and learning in the state, not just as a way to get out of the statewide assessment. And the other side of the risk is that it will be that it would actually hurt the innovation movement. We really want we at Excel and Ed really want this pilot to be successful. If states rush into it and aren't able to make a success of it because they don't have the technical or financial capacity, that could also do damage to the innovation movement in the long term. So our current recommendation on this to states is that really think carefully, be thoughtful, and this, I should say, the timeline, this current U.S. Department of Education is very interested in this pilot, so the timeline for this and its availability will probably be the same timeline or close to it for the transition to ESSA. So this is something that will start to be available probably applying next year to begin somewhere around that 17-18 school year. So this is really a real thing for states, but only for the right states that really have buy-in, have the technical capacity and the support to make it a success. Our recommendation is that it's something that should be started right now in pilot form in your districts, laying the groundwork to assess whether this is something that would be appealing and the right fit for your state. Really a huge commitment, but a real opportunity to really change the way that we assess, and someplace we hope a lot of states will eventually move, just a matter of when. Are there any questions on the pilot? No, great. Well, I think I will, it's been a pleasure. I will send it back. Alex, if you'd like to wrap us up with any final notes.
Sure, and just as we noted earlier, next week's webinar, we're going to take a deeper dive into a couple of the other categories of accountability that we talked about, school identification, interventions. Again, we're going to send the video and the PowerPoint deck that you've seen today. We're going to send it out to everybody, so you'll have a second chance to view, or if you want to share that. But we're happy and available to provide technical assistance and any kind of support that you need regarding all the topics that we delved into today. Some of the most in-depth assistance we've provided today has been on the discussions of accountability metrics and assessments and how that all works together. So just let us know, let Claire know, let myself know, or anybody on your team, and we're happy to help, and we hope to see you again next week. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all. Enjoy your week.